Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. On this episode of Horns, we listen into an interview conducted at the Strauss Center for Law and International Security at the University of Texas, Austin. The interview was conducted as part of the Brumley Fellowship Program and is hosted by Brianna Kablack, one of the Brumley Fellows at the LBJ School at the University of Texas, Austin. Brianna is interviewing Tess Owen of Vice News, who for the past 6 years has covered the domestic extremism beat. Their talk discusses the evolution and developments that Ms. Owen has seen in the course of reporting on domestic extremism over that time, including the evolution of what she refers to as suit and tie extremists, as well as the mainstreaming of increasingly extremist views. Let's listen in.
Today, I'm very happy and excited to invite and announce Tess Owen, who is a current senior reporter at Vice News. She'll be joining us for our discussion on extremism in the United States. Tess has a master's in journalism from Columbia University, is originally from the UK, and has been covering these issues at Vice since 2015. Part of the reason that I wanted to invite Tess to join us today is because I often feel that the real-life human experience is often lost at the policy level. With domestic terrorism becoming so mainstream in recent years, and particularly since January 6th, I thought this was a great opportunity to invite someone like Tess, who has a lot of on-the-ground insight about these extremist groups and movement. She's here to talk to us about her experience reporting on these issues and the human elements behind these issues so that we can better understand what policies can do to better address them and plan for any unforeseen consequences. So with that in mind, I will open it up to Tess to give us a bit of an introduction on her reporting and recent topics.
Thank you so much for having me. So when I first started out in journalism, I was covering the Black Lives Matter movement and police brutality. And at the same time, because as general assignment, when you first start out, I was also, I wrote about a lot of mass shootings, including the 2015 shooting at a Black church in Charleston by a white supremacist. I was also paying close attention to anti-immigration groups or anti-Muslim groups who were seemingly making inroads with mainstream politics, and also how they established ties to some top-level officials in the Trump administration. I also covered the surge in hate crimes around the 2016 election. And from there, I started tracking as well the sort of emergence of, I guess, suit and tie white nationalists who were recruiting on college campuses, and how they were sort of using rhetoric that had been pushed by these anti-immigrant groups, and how they were using that to sort of recruit and also kind of gain legitimacy in their own way.
So Tess, I think it would be an interesting point to start with kind of an overview on the people that you interact with in these extremist movements. So my first question for you is, what has surprised you most about the individuals that you've reported on and interviewed that are involved in these militia and extremist movements around the country?
So I've definitely covered a sort of mixed buffet of far-right extremists, from, again, like I said, the suit and tie white nationalists to the sort of hardcore neo-Nazis, who are maybe what you think of or what you used to think of when you thought of, the far-right extremists, the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, which are for people who don't know, are the anti-government kind of insurgent group who wear Hawaiian shirts and AR-15s, then to the more kind of traditional militia groups. And then also, I think probably one of the most troubling, and maybe this is what I found most surprising because I found them the most troubling, is the intersection between extremism, extremist ideas, and mainstream politics. And I think this is what we really saw throughout 2020 with the anti-lockdown protests, and how kind of the fringe grievances driving some of those protests were being echoed at the highest levels of government, to some of the language and rhetoric and organizing in response to Black Lives Matter in the summer, and then the Stop the Steal movement, which brought us up to the January 6th. So I think that seeing that kind of joining of forces between extremists and ordinary people, I guess I found the most troubling.
And going off of that, I know that you've been covering these issues for the past kind of 5 to 6 years at this point. Have you seen kind of the ideological motivations and goals of these individuals change in that time period, or have they largely stayed the same throughout the time that you've been reporting on this?
So I think Charlottesville was a pretty big turning point because you had these suit and tie white nationalists who are quite optics conscious, and they, aspire for political legitimacy. And they realize that the optics of them marching alongside like skinheads and hardcore neo-Nazis was bad for what they wanted overall. So I think after Charlottesville, there was this real schism in the movement where you had sort of groups like, well, now defunct groups like Identity Europa, who rebranded and got very clever at euphemism. So they were already pretty good at masking their very basic racist ideas in more sanitized language, but I think they got even better at doing that, partly to avoid social media crackdowns, which came after Charlottesville, but also as a way to sort of recover and to, again, gain legitimacy. So there was that happening. And at the same time, I think because big tech, after basically allowing these people to organize and share their propaganda and recruit on mainstream platforms, they scrambled to cut ties and deplatform people. So there were also a movement of the kind of more hardcore contingent who then went to sort of Telegram or 8chan or Gab, where I think some of those networks became like very like echo chambers for extremely violent ideas that kind of snowballed.
Coming from sort of the policy perspective of things, a lot of times we look at what communication frameworks exists between individuals who have insight and information about these extremist movements and law enforcement who are able to act on this insight. And I had posed this question to you earlier, and I'm really interested for you to kind of elaborate on it. What is the role that you've seen law enforcement play with journalists as you cover these movements? Are there frameworks that you have to communicate with law enforcement? Is that something that you tend to avoid?
I'm encouraged to, as a reporter, cultivate sources within law enforcement. But that's kind of expected to be more or less a one-way street where they're bringing me information. We would not overall cooperate with law enforcement. We're not going to see something online and go and bring that to law enforcement necessarily. I don't know what we would do if we uncovered evidence of like an impending immediate threat. I imagine that maybe we make an exception, but I've never been in that situation. And then on the other side of things, there's sort of personal safety of journalists. So this has never happened to me specifically, but I know other people who have had threats against their safety, against their life, which have had to been escalated to law enforcement. But overall, we try to, we're not law enforcement, and we try to keep as much of a distance from that as possible.
So I'd like to turn now to the impact that some of the latest legislative efforts might have on these movements. So there's obviously a lot of discussion around content moderation. One of the biggest topics right now in the news is should we or should we not reform Section 230? And then I know in your own reporting, kind of dating back to your early days at Vice, you've been following gun control and Second Amendment issues. So I'm curious from your perspective, as these legislative efforts kind of ebb and wane over the years, how have you seen them impact these extremist movements on the ground? Do you see people becoming more radicalized more quickly? How do you see radicalization, recruitment, communication efforts change on different platforms? What does it look like from your point of view?
So I will say one of the biggest differences, for example, post January 6th to post Charlottesville, is post Charlottesville when there was this big effort to deplatform these groups or these ideas. There wasn't an infrastructure to catch them when they landed. So there were fewer fringe platforms, fewer fringe host domain providers that could support these people or these groups somewhere else outside of Facebook or Twitter. Now that's not the case. You have Rumble, you have Parler, you have Gab, you have an entire different ecosystem. So I think that's one thing to think about. The other thing I do think is it has gotten a bit better in terms of, for example, the YouTube algorithm. A couple of years ago, YouTube was extremely culpable in radicalizing a lot of people because of how its algorithm was. If you watched, an extremist video, and then it would just throw up increasingly extreme content for you to keep watching. And so you go down these extremist rabbit holes. I think now, though, because there's so many alternative sites that are actually quite sophisticated, the problem does run a bit deeper. For example, one site that I've relied on quite heavily for my reporting is called My Militia. And My Militia has options where, there's a chat options. There's also an option where it's like you click a button saying form a militia. So you build your own militia by zip code. There's PDF libraries with bomb making instructions, everything that you can possibly imagine. And it's actually a very sophisticated website on a lot of levels. So I think the fact that those are out there is obviously a problem.
What do you think is missing from the kind of policy conversation on the topic of extremism? Like I said, I think oftentimes policymakers have a bird's eye view of what's going on, which is often missing the more human elements to the conversation. And I'm just curious what you think policymakers might be missing from the conversation that should be receiving more attention.
I think that one of the biggest, and I mentioned it before, one of the biggest missing pieces is obviously, and rightfully so, there's been so much laser focus on the roles of known extremist groups in January 6th and just participating in political violence overall in the last years or so. But I think that the bigger, more complex problem lies in the middle of extremism and mainstream. Obviously, that's hard for content moderators. It's hard for policymakers. It's hard for the military when they're deciding who is radicalized and who's not. And I think that the conversation about that space is also, it's a cultural one as well. It comes down to education and value systems. And those may be harder conversations to have. And they're also thornier because it brings in mainstream politics. And it's hard to have those conversations without seeming like you're pointing fingers. But I think that's one of the biggest missing pieces. I think that the FBI calls them inspired actor. I can't remember the exact term, but people who basically has been radicalized by the last year, the event of the last year, these ideas that have gone mainstream.
How do you choose what you're reporting on? So obviously you said that a lot of the events that spurred your recent reporting are some of the protests that started last year. There was a lot of kind of protests following different mass violent attacks. And people are asking if you cover the broad range of political protests and violence, or if you cover only specific events along the extremist spectrum.
When I choose to cover a specific group, or I guess a story on this topic, I always try to ask myself that there has to be something else that you're saying. You can't just be like, oh, there's this group and it exists. It's like, what are the institutions that are enabling this group to exist or to recruit? How are they recruiting? Do they have money? Do they have an inroad with mainstream politicians? What are their spheres of influence like? It's not enough to just say, oh, there's a group that exists and they're going out and hanging out on their street corner, once a week with guns. It has to be something more about the power that they have. So that's kind of how I guide my story choosing, I guess.
How do you respond to the kind of there are both sides argument? Meaning there is violence on the left and violence on the right. Why is it that we're often talking about the right? So kind of what's your response to the both sides argument?
My response to the both sides argument is that the data doesn't support a both sides approach. And if the data, I don't have the exact numbers with me, but the FBI's own numbers about, for example, deaths caused by far-right extremists compared to anti-fascists or left-wing. I think there's been one murder by an anti-fascist in 3 decades, which, that doesn't mean that murder isn't worth talking about and investigating. But in terms of the urgency with which you treat one problem, I think it just misses the point if you lump it all in together. And I also like to point out as well that when people talk about Antifa, when I'm writing about Antifa, I now talk about Antifa, the conspiracy theory, versus anti-fascist, because I think that because Antifa is so decentralized and nebulous, that it's really just often used as a rhetorical tool and a boogeyman to describe something that you don't like. So, yeah, I think, if the data supported the both sides approach, I would go for it.
A data-driven approach to journalism. What role do you think that foreign actors have played in stoking the flames of some of this domestic extremism? Or do you think it is mostly just a homegrown thing? Do we even need foreign influence, or are we sowing our own divisions?
Obviously, there are disinformation campaigns or bot networks that are out there, and that those have been identified, and that those are also responsible for amplifying false narratives. But I think we also have to look at why are people so vulnerable? Why is the country so vulnerable to those narratives or to disinformation? And part of it's maybe distrust in institutions or in the government, or these deep-seated anti-government ideas that we need to talk about. But I also think that by deflecting and looking overseas is also missing the point about the very long-standing issues within this country.
How likely are we to see an increase in rural extremism, especially given federal support for gun control and additional taxes on gas?
I do think that experts across the board who've studied the militia movement, for example, have pretty much are in agreement that they expect to see a surge in anti-government or militia activity. And that's partly because, the initial militia movement emerged in the 1990s, and that was also coincided with quite significant gun bills, including the assault rifle bill. And I think that the militia movement has sort of ebbed and flowed in terms of whether there's a Democrat administration or not. But I think before Biden had even taken office, militias were recruiting aggressively around the idea of an impending gun grabbing campaign from the Biden administration. And this is one of my fears because, common sense gun control is something that the Democrats have promised and Biden has promised. But at the same time, I can already see that any movement in that direction is also going to be a recruitment boon for extremist groups or anti-government groups.
Going off the idea of recruitment and kind of a boom in these groups, I know that in academia and in research and in journalism a lot, there's the fear of amplifying the kind of voices and the ideologies of these extremist movements. How do you view and approach the issue of amplification with your reporting?
So we were talking about this a little bit earlier, but I think that the extremism beat, as we call it, used to be quite niche. And there was probably a handful of us scattered across different outlets. And over the years, I think we've sort of self-policed a little bit and developed a informal code of ethics to sort of guide our reporting on extremism. And it's definitely been a learning curve, and I have not always gotten it right. But I think that, we've tried to figure out a way to report on these actors and these topics without inadvertently, like you say, amplifying their ideas or portraying them in a light that they want to be seen. So, for example, I remember there was, not to call out specific news organizations, but I think there was a CNN interview a couple of years ago where they invited white nationalist Richard Spencer, who helped organize Unite the Right. And he was there as an expert talking about extremism in a suit, wearing a collared shirt and a tie. And that's how he wanted to be seen, was a respectable, legitimate person. So I guess being aware of what they want and how they want to be seen, and doing what you can to counter that. And I guess the other thing I'd say is, at least for my reporting, is that typically I don't really care about what they want. Maybe it's useful for me to know, but I don't think I need to print what they want or what they believe in. The most interesting things are what they, how they recruit. Do they have money? Where are they organizing? What platforms are they using? What inroads do they have? That sort of thing.
There's sort of a ballooning fear of more kind of well-connected, well-trained individuals joining these extremist groups. And we have some questions about how serious is this risk, just based on your reporting and the individuals that you've interviewed.
So I have heard as well that this is one of the sort of biggest concerns for DHS, is the idea of an insider threat. I think that, we have, through my reporting in the recent years, we have exposed a number of active duty military who were involved with neo-Nazi groups or neo-Nazi platforms, or sort of more, or Proud Boys or white nationalists. I think that, again, one of the more concerning, I think that those are very concerning in their own ways, but one of the things that I'm seeing now and that I've been reporting on at least are, I guess, more informal networks online who operate very much out in the open and are actually hard to pin down ideologically, because, again, they blend the extreme with the mainstream. And they also rely a lot on sort of memes and trolling and humor to deflect what they're actually about. You saw that a little bit with the Boogaloo movement, for example. And Boogaloos, despite the fact that they are, ultimately what the Boogaloo movement wanted is a civil war or to overthrow the government, which, you have to wonder why you'd be active duty in the military and also ascribing to an ideology like that. So I think spin-offs from those sorts of groups are really concerning, especially as they get more adept at using language that can help them, skirt social media bans and allow them to sort of operate in the open.
Going off of some of the fears about people involved in these groups, I'm seeing a number of questions about issues around mental health in those that are involved in extremism. In your experience, does it appear that kind of mental health questions and that those involved are not as healthy as the general population? Is that something that rings true in your experience? Or do you think that that's kind of overstated in some of the reporting in media that we've seen?
I think it really depends on what flavor or what kind of extremism you're talking about. If you're talking about the militia movement or the anti-government movement, the traditional militia movement, not like the Boogaloos, I think that there is such a culture and institutions that sort of support that way of thinking and that way of life. From even just sort of some sheriff's departments are very cozy with militia groups, even just the sort of anti-government rhetoric that you see also kind of repeated by groups like the NRA, for example. But then when you go into like QAnon, for example, I do think that QAnon that is a mental health crisis in a lot of ways, and that it should be treated as such. And I think that that's being increasingly recognized in the way that it's treated in the media, because I think it's very easy to just treat something like QAnon as like a crazy curiosity, but I don't know if anyone's ever heard of this. There's a subreddit called QAnon Casualties, which in which people talk about family members or friends who have been brainwashed by QAnon, and it's absolutely heartbreaking, really, really heartbreaking. And I think it also is a very valuable insight into how troubled a lot of people are who fall into this sort of world.
Definitely. And I think the discussion and kind of the nuance that you're teasing out right now about the importance of segmenting extremism, it's not a one-size-fits-all problem, and policy shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all solution. Do you believe that there is a way for civil society and U.S. residents to combat extremism, or do you think that it's more of a government responsibility to do so?
Yeah, I think that there is a way for civil society to combat extremism. I think that for example, I think I wrote a story a couple of years ago about teachers who were putting together a guide for other teachers to learn or to understand whether someone in their, a student in their class was showing signs of being radicalized. And it wasn't just, a kid walking in with a swastika on your backpack, like it might have used to be in the past, but it's actually much more subtle, much more nuanced, and you have to be familiar with the very specific code languages and as an ever-evolving language as well. So it's not that you can just, read a list of the words that you should be looking out for and be done with it. You have to be, this is for content moderators as well as teachers, as well as parents. You have to be constantly kind of engaged with what the latest symbols or signs of perhaps being radicalized are. So I think that's part of it. And as far as, just as your, every day, I'm not really sure, to be honest.
I think it's something that a lot of us are grappling with right now. Have you engaged with any former extremists in your reporting, and what lessons have you taken away from that? Have you seen certain prevention frameworks work? Is it something else that helps these people disengage with extremism? What have you experienced?
I think that prevention frameworks and de-radicalization programs are extremely valuable, and I think it can be very important to hear from those people who have gone through that process. But I do think that at the same time, and this is partly lawmakers and also media problem as well, is that the hunger for a redemption story or a redemption narrative has created a space in which it's become sort of profitable to be a former extremist. I've seen some cases, and I've spoken to some former extremists who seemingly de-radicalized overnight, and before they knew it, were being flown over the country to speak at events and getting paid to go on TV. And I think that that's all well and good, but if you haven't done the work of what it takes to de-radicalize and to seriously reflect on the harm that you've caused and how you got there in the first place, I don't think that you can be a spokesperson for the movement. So, yeah, I think balancing, obviously those stories are useful, balancing the need for that with also seeing whether they are legitimate and have done the work.
It's really interesting. And I'm curious, kind of within your own personal ethics and journalistic ethics, how do you cover an individual who has seemingly radicalized overnight, but maybe hasn't put in the investment to honestly sort of de-radicalize and change their own ideologies? How do you report on something like that?
I think you let the reader decide. You would say, okay, so this person says they are not anymore, but I think it depends on how I was covering it. So if it was just a profile on this person or a profile on the process of de-radicalization, you could let the readers decide whether you thought it was working or not. If it was somebody who if I just wanted a quick quote, I just wouldn't use them. I think I would just, if they're not an authentic voice for the process of de-radicalization, then it's not helpful.
How do you manage your own personal safety? I'm not sure if Vice has certain frameworks in place or if you do anything extra, but a number of people are asking how you manage your own personal safety as a reporter.
So Vice has an amazing security team. Cannot speak highly enough of them. Obviously, the freelancers do not have the same luxury of having security like I do. So, there's my personal security for when I go to events, which increasingly now when I go to cover any kinds of protests, it usually requires a vest of some kind, a helmet and a mask and ballistic glasses. I think in terms of my online safety, my personal safety, or my OPSEC, they've helped me make sure that all my information is not identifiable. Like you can't find out where I live and everything like that. I've never been doxxed, which is, when people publish your information online, and I'm very happy that I haven't been. But one thing that is interesting is that the harassment campaigns that have either been launched against me or other people, they're often very intentional. So a group of people decided online that they're going to go after a particular person, and then they go for it. I think a researcher sent me a screenshot of some Boogaloos discussing a harassment campaign against me, and they decided it would be bad for their optics to be going after a female journalist. But I've also wrote a story recently involving a bunch of sort of Boogaloo-related network of military people, and they activated this sort of troll network against me, but it was obviously very intentional.
And I know that you are originally from the UK, so you're kind of approaching maybe some of these domestic extremism and specifically Second Amendment issues from a bit of an outside perspective. So can you elaborate a little bit on how your viewpoint has maybe changed over the past few years of reporting on these topics, and how those maybe across the pond might see these issues slightly differently?
Yeah, I did not grow up around anywhere near guns, and guns were just not anything to do with my life. That I even really saw guns apart from maybe counterterrorism police at airports. So to go from that to then finding myself at events where I'm like surrounded by people with guns and think at one point so crowded where someone was like knocking me in the head with the barrel of their rifle. It's quite a strange transition. I definitely think that's been one of the biggest learning areas for me, because I think I've come to understand and respect that guns are very important to people in this country. And I'm never going to fully empathize with that necessarily, but I have to have some respect for the fact that it's just important. So I think that, and also be quite normal. I was also at the same time been sort of numbed, I guess, as well to being around so many guns, which is also a strange thing. But yeah, I think sometimes I kind of overcorrect sometimes, if that makes sense, by being too open-minded about guns. I'd be like, okay, no, actually, this is ridiculous. So I think I have to find kind of a line between the two mindsets.
Yeah, I was not expecting you to say that you would kind of overcorrect in the other direction, but I guess that's part of the job. You and I had talked about this a little bit previously as well, but in light of a lot of the claims that media tends to lean to the left, and a lot of the reality of the disinformation campaigns that have been launched specifically over the past 4 or 5 years, do you have any concern about, I guess, these claims that the media tends to lean left? And if you do, what does Vice and you as a reporter at Vice do to address those claims?
I mean, we have a dedicated disinformation reporter. His name's David Gilbert. He does a very good job, and he has a sort of newsletter every morning where he talks about whatever the disinformation topics of the day are. I don't think it's necessarily changed how I do my job, because we just tell the stories that we want to do, and we use facts to guide that. But in terms of encountering hostility out in the field, I mean, that happens pretty much. That's like par for the course, I think, on the beat. I'm not going places where people love me, but I get a lot of, oh, you're bankrolled by George Soros, or you're an Antifa reporter, or, all of that sort of thing. So that's just kind of to be expected. And it is frustrating as well when you see people saying, say that they won't read the article because it's from Vice, because obviously the people are so divided, or people are so sort of deeply entrenched in their different teams that they won't read something for what it is. But yeah.
And as we near the end of the talk, I think I will let you choose whether you want to leave us on an optimistic or a pessimistic note in your answer. But I'm curious, so, obviously you've been covering these issues at Vice since 2015. You've seen kind of a lot of the momentum change as different events and different administrations come through. And I'm curious where you think the trend of extremism is heading. Are things getting worse? Are more people joining on more dark web platforms, or are things getting better? What is your view kind of on where we're heading with this issue?
On the positive side of things, I think that one of the biggest problems of the last 4 years has been the fact that, you had fringe grievances that were being that were being run all the way up the chain to the president. And you had this sort of very dangerous feedback loop where when you have elected officials who are echoing the same kind of language that you're hearing, that you first heard on 8chan or something, and then in turn that gives them an air of legitimacy, it creates a very dangerous and volatile situation, I think. So now with that sort of one top layer cut off now, I think with Trump out of the picture, who I do think was responsible for perpetuating some of those, conspiracy theories and dangerous narratives, I think that it's weakened the movement a little bit. However, I also think that the amount of disinformation and hostility I'm seeing to the Biden administration, and specifically like in response to like gun control or proposed gun control, that's something that really worries me, as well as just like ongoing deep political divisions that I don't see getting healed in the immediate future. But hopefully everyone will get their vaccine and have a great summer and just, move on.
Well, I love ending it on an optimistic note. I know oftentimes it can be a very heavy topic. I'm sure it weighs you down to report on it. So I appreciate kind of the optimism. And I think a lot of us are hoping that there are some more solutions that can be found both at the government, civil society, and individual levels.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.